Hey everyone, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to get HTMX targets from web requests in F# Giraffe, which is one of the more popular web frameworks for F#. Now, I build most of my projects with F#, Giraffe, and HTMX sprinkled in when I need a little bit more dynamism. In this post, I'll share how I get HTMX targets from a web request in F# Giraffe, as well as how I use that to build apps with HTMX. And thus, why is this even useful? First, let's start off with how HTMX targets actually work. So an HTMX target declared with HX target allows you to target a specific element on the page to swap returned HTML with. And so, the whole power of HTMX is it allows any element to make a web request, but also what it allows you to do is declare on the front end, what do I do with the returned HTML? And so this is how it's unlocking partial reloads using just very basic built-in browser capabilities. And so this target thing is really how you say, this is where you put that HTML that is returned. Now, I personally like to build my apps with isolated interactive islands powered by HTMX, so I use targets as a unique identifier for a specific element. There's a lot of ways you can do targeting, and it's really going to depend on how you kind of organize your app. But the way that I like to use HTMX is really I like to build my app as a multi-page application. So very simple, basically static. And then for components on the page, there's usually one, maybe up to 3 components that actually would benefit from HTMX. I make them basically self-contained sections of a page, and then I sprinkle in HTMX only on those so that they can re-render themselves. And this way I'm getting kind of the simplicity of multi-page applications along with the power of HTMX, and targets is really what makes this possible. And so the way that you do this, we'll assume HTMX is on your web page, and then here's just some HTML, and then you're just going to give it an ID, and then basically you would say here's the action that you would want HTMX to do on trigger. It's a button, so the trigger is going to be by default when you click it, and then use HTMX target to say hey, after I send the request to wherever we said the action should go, I want you to put this stuff in here. And so this is an ID target, and so it would target itself. And so the way that this works really is that, you would trigger this. Here it's a button, so you'd trigger it by clicking. It would send its request here, and then it would include the other information it has, like the target on the request as well. And then as an endpoint, what we're going to do is we're going to read that target from the web request, and then based on the target, we can actually change the HTML that we're going to return. And so we can return the HTML based on the request and the target. And then finally, once that HTML is returned, the browser swaps the HTML into the target based on however you've configured this. So that's how it basically works. Okay, so now let's go and talk about how to get the actual target from a web request in F# and Giraffe, because this is really where the majority of your processing is happening, because HTMX is really a server-side rendered paradigm. And so the way that Giraffe passes information about a request is with an HTTP context. There's a link to its documentation. You can learn more about there. And we can basically use that to access data on it, like get its headers, get its payload if it has it, look at query params, all things like that. And so HTMX itself, when it is sending these requests that have a target on it, it's going to have 2 headers on it. First is HX request, and this basically tells you whether this is an HTMX request or not. If it's missing, or I guess I should say HTMX always adds this on its own request, and so you can look at it to determine if present, then it's from HTMX. And then the next one is HX target, which is going to say what is the element that, or I guess the ID of the element that you have in this HX target attribute right here. And so basically what we can do is we can just create a little function that will look at the HTTP context that Giraffe gives us, and then it will return the target from it if it exists. And so this function first just checks if it's an HTMX request, because if it's not an HTMX request, we don't want to do anything. Anything else on there is bogus for this. And then if it does have the HTMX request, then we try to get the target off of it. And so here we take in that HTTP context. We're going to return a prime A option. Here would just be a string option. We're going to use this helper on context to try and get the request header of HX request. And then we're going to use option.bind to say basically if this is some, so we are able to find it, then we're going to look at HX target. And then this is kind of railroading, where if this was none, then this would just go through as none. All right, so how do I use HTMX targets in production web apps? I already kind of talked about this, how I like to build it mainly as an MPA because it's very simple, and then I just sprinkle in some HTMX for those interactive islands that are useful. And so the way that this usually works is that first we have a few phases, I guess, that we're kind of composing together. The first is an endpoint, and this is going to parse the request data into page props. And so we're kind of turning from DTO over to what is the core data model of my rendering logic. This should kind of feel similar if you've been in React land, going from app data into this is what this means for the component. There's this kind of translation phase. Next is to have a page, right? So we're doing server-side rendering, and I really think that multi-page applications doing one page at a time is very simple, and it keeps the information and behavior very close together. And so this is usually an easier way I found to build pages. And so I like to have one endpoint per page, really. And then obviously if there's some side actions, we can have different endpoints for that. But really for the rendering part, I really like to have one endpoint. And then so what this thing does, it's going to render its full page like an MPA using these page props. And then it's going to compose smaller components together. And so this might be interactive islands. It's probably going to be your nav bar, it's going to be your footer, these smaller components that we're used to building in React land, these purish components. This is where you put all those together into a cohesive page. And then where targets comes in is, we now have one entry point to render the full page. Now what we can do, and because we have this, I should say, we know we have all the props necessary in order to render the full page. And this is very crucial when dealing with state, I think, and kind of web requests, because we want things to be deterministic based on URL often, or I guess URL to data. And so because we have this one entry point for everything, and we know that this is what creates the full page, we can now use the targets to have a conditional to only render specific components of the page. And so, you can imagine that this is the full page and it's composing smaller components. Well, all we would need to do here is say well, if the target is, I don't know, this set of cards or the comment section or something, we will just only render the components, and we already know how to go from URL or request data props into the full thing. And so therefore, this will be deterministic based on URL to data. And then just to round things off, these components that I'm talking about usually are going to be pure-ish components that are easy to compose together. And this is kind of imperative shell, functional core. Intuitively, we kind of know that we need to do this. This is how Next.js pushes you to do things. This is how SvelteKit pushes you to do things. This is how React pushes you to do things. It's trying to separate the data from the rendering layer. And we kind of try to have a top level place where we're keeping state, and then that kind of flows down into rendering your components so that those components are flexible, and then we don't run into all these reactive data syncing issues and stuff. And so this is how you can do that same kind of thing in the server-side rendered paradigm as well. And so that's how I kind of think about this. And so what this does for me is, it makes it easier for me to reuse these components because they're all these small, purish, just kind of UI components, right? Here's a nav bar, here's the comment section, here's how you do this stuff. But you also get the power of HTMX for partial re-rendering because the page can control what things need to be dynamic and stuff. But we're also have one path for rendering, so we can get deterministic page props as opposed to having to basically rebuild RPC on every HTMX request, which is annoying. And we also keep the simplicity of MPAs because we just have this kind of one entry point for these things. And when you do this, then you can kind of do something like this to pass the target into your rendering code, right? This is a helper function to build an HTTP handler just from an HTTP context. And so you would do here's my endpoint that Giraffe understands, and then it would call into this HTTP handler. And then so it takes in the context here, and then we have a task, and then we're going to get the target using that helper that we just built. And then we might call our component along with target. This is very simplified. Usually you'd have more props that you're putting in. Things converting from whatever's in your URL, parameters and stuff like that would probably get passed in as well alongside your target. And then inside your rendering code, obviously just build up your HTML as, using whatever you're using. Might be templating, might be a string, might be HTML DSL. I personally use Giraffe.viewEngine. And then basically what you would do is you'd have a match statement where if no target, you're just going to render the full thing. but if there is a target, then just render a part of that. And that way we're getting very, deterministic. If this is input, this is the outputs we're getting, and we're kind of removing a lot of the complexity of having to deal with like so many endpoints for rendering. We just kind of usually have one. Now this is exactly what I did in my latest project, 1,000 checkboxes. You can learn more about here. And basically what it's doing is it's just a multi-page application, and then has a checkbox grid inside of it that refreshes itself on a delay. And we're using targets to make sure that when the checkbox grid wants to refresh itself, we only return that thing from the main endpoint. If you want to see what this looks like, my Humanians members gets full access to project source code like 1,000 checkboxes, project repos here, along with dozens of other projects that I've built and shared before. Next. So I've been happily building little websites with F#, Giraffe, and HTMX for the past several months, and I think there's going to be more to come. I really like this idea of simpler websites. It's very powerful. I get to stay basically all in F# land. It's very scalable. Like there's just like very little cruft. It's just very simple, just simple functions, building simple HTML, doing things with little endpoints. Like it just is simple, but also powerful. So it feels good to build with. Question for you is, how are you building web apps with HTMX, and what are you finding difficult to implement? I'm always curious to see what other people are doing, to see if there's other things I could be doing better. And also this helps me figure out like if a lot of people are having a single problem, maybe I'll go make a guide about that. Now, if you like this post, you might also like simple interactive islands with F# and HTMX, and kind of more about how I think about these non-granular, kind of coarse-grained interactive islands for balancing simplicity with power. Might also be interested in how to build a full-stack web app with F#, how I think about building full-stack web apps, and kind of a paved road for deciding maybe how you want to build your own web apps. And finally, what it's like to run HTMX in production, stories from experienced software engineers if you're more interested in like, what does this look like at scale? That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.